Customers notice your implementation, not your strategy. But with over 2/3 of implementations failing globally, leaders' current thinking and approach needs to change. The Strategy Implementation Institute has been created by Antonio Neito-Rodriguez and Robin Speculant to develop implementation specialists around the world. The Institute provides professional and fellowship certification for people who are looking to be recognized as implementation specialists and to acquire a unique skill set that many leaders are currently missing. The online course is structured around the Strategy Implementation Roadmap, or SIRP, and has 7 modules. Each module covers the 4 implementation stages: crafting, embedding, executing, and sustaining. The course adopts videos, articles, quizzes, case studies, and other material to build your implementation knowledge and allows you to engage with other participants. Join the implementation community. www.strategyimplementationinstitute.org allows you to acquire new skills. Adopt the Strategy Implementation Roadmap for your own use. Become a contributor to the living body of knowledge and to be recognized by your peers as an implementation specialist.
So, Antonio, you are on the video. Strategy implementation. You're gonna tell us a lot about it tonight. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about, I think it's a good connection to what we've been talking last week on the Project Revolution. Saadi, also it links very well with Dr. Al's discussion yesterday. And also your first talk about breaking silos. It's all about implementation. So yes, I'm excited to have the talk with Mark, with you, Saadi, and all the audience, which I know they put very tough questions.
Yes, actually, I've put some questions for yourself, Mark, and I might have some insights on them. I think this is very interesting. So while we're waiting, let's play another video. Okay?
Okay.
We're delighted to be launching the Strategy Implementation Institute that has been a journey of 3 years of a shared passion for both of us to get to this point today.
A very long project. We started in Dubai, remember, and then London, Brussels, Reykjavik, and we keep working on this because we're big believers that there's a gap, there's an opportunity to do things better for you as a leader, organizations as well.
And it's that shared passion to create implementation specialists around the world that has brought us to this point today in Reykjavik, together to launch the Strategy Implementation Institute.
And we're happy also to have a fantastic board of advisors with some of the top thinkers and practitioners that have guided us through the process to come up with this course, certification, and the institute.
So we look forward to you joining the community and becoming an implementation specialist. I'm Robin Speculant, a specialist in strategy and digital implementation. One of the challenges I see among leaders is that they've been trained how to plan, but not how to implement. And this causes so many organizations to fail at their implementation. Strategy is all about making the right choices. Implementation is about taking the right actions. Once you've decided how you will differentiate from your competitors, you then have to drive the strategy throughout the whole organization and ensure your people are taking the right actions. But this is a discipline that many organizations lack in. And just to emphasize the point, let me share with you a riddle. 5 birds sit on a fence. 3 decide to leave. How many birds are left on the fence? Once again, 5 birds sit on a fence. 3 decide to leave. How many are left on the fence? Well, some of you might be saying 0, 2, 5. The correct answer is 5. Why 5? Because they had a phenomenal meeting to discuss what to do to execute the strategy. They attended a conference call on the first Monday of every month discussing how to implement the strategy, but they never took the right actions. I wish you all the success on your implementation journey.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're here.
Hello. Okay. Hello, Mark. How are you?
Very well. How are you? Glad to be
good.
here.
Very pleased that you're joining us tonight. It's night here where we are. Also, I'd like to again welcome everybody to our panel tonight on strategy implementation. I'd like to welcome my 2 most distinguished guests, Mark Langley. For those of you who do not know Mark, which I doubt, Mark has been PMI CEO and president from 2010 until 2018. This means much of the success and growth PMI is undergoing today was seeded back then in these 8 or 9 years. And for this, Mark, allow me to thank you from myself and from our audience and welcome you again.
Oh, thank you. It was my honor, and I appreciate being here.
Thank you very much. And Antonio Neito-Rodriguez, last week we saw you with us. We are very happy to have you again and again. You see, the thing about Antonio, you become addicted to him. Once you start to listen to okay, you cannot get enough of Antonio. Antonio is also very famous for me to introduce him. He's one of Thinkers 50. He's one of the people who wrote in Harvard Business Review. He's an author, international speaker, and of course he was chairman for PMI Board of Directors in 2016, plus many more things. Okay, so having said that, let's start. And I'd like to kick off about strategy implementation. We have a lot of things to discuss tonight. Antonio prepared some statistics and some quick polls just to get us on the right start, if you like. But before that, before opening a formal discussion, I'd like you, Mark, to tell us what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the term strategy implementation.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is how many organizations actually struggle with implementing their strategy. I think there's been decades of publications that have approached it from different angles with all the same focus, which is most organizations, no matter how elaborate or beautiful their strategy, struggle to implement it and achieve success ultimately. And in the process, they waste billions, if not trillions of dollars due to poor implementation. So what I first think of is there's an opportunity, not just a challenge, in developing and implementing strategy. And it really begins with some of the focus of what we did at PMI with the Bright Line Initiative and other areas, but also the area of the Strategy Implementation Institute, which is taking it to the next level to really focus on closing that gap between strategy delivery and strategy development and strategy implementation.
Thank you. This is good. Now, Antonio, what's the first thing? If you are asked to tell us only one thing about strategy implementation, what's the most important thing that comes to your mind?
Well, I'm 100% aligned with Mark. We when we were together in the board and his CEO, we launched Brightline because we saw that need. For me, maybe from a project management perspective, strategy implementation is what brings project management to the higher level, to the C-suite, to the CEO. It makes the topic relevant to organizations, board of directors, shareholders. So it's elevating what we do in the project management profession to the board, to the leadership team, and helping them get the execution, the implementation done.
Okay, thank you.
And
We're gonna go
you,
back
Saadi,
to yes.
Saadi, for you.
From me, okay, you're asking me.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, okay. To me, the way I look at it, in organizations, we have permanent structures and we have temporary structures. Projects are temporary. Programs are temporary, but they generate operations after they finish to sustain the whole business, and they change the business. Whereas portfolio is purely permanent. And portfolio management is about realizing the strategy. There has always been a gap, and I'm talking about from the actual on-the-ground practical implementation aspect, which we see in large corporates, organization, and government ministries and authorities. They really actually suffer. It's like you are trying to steer the wheel, but the drive that you do, the wheels are not 100% aligned with it. Okay, this is one thing. The other thing is that I remember from what you both said now, what we used to tell people about risk. Identifying risks do not get them to go away if we don't do anything about them. I believe strategy is exactly the same. Okay, we spend billions on strategy to identify and put strategies and very nice dashboards and KPIs and whatnot and fancy things. But how much effort do we exert to actually realize the strategy? Are they the same people, the ones who write the strategy and the ones who actually implement it? Perhaps these are things we can discuss tonight together.
Fantastic.
Okay, great. So let me start with a very small and quick presentation that Antonio prepared, because it includes some polls. We'd like to get the engagement of our audience within these polls. So in a second.
So we can all comment on this, Mark. And
sure.
Just next slide. I think I think Mark said that as well. We see a clear need for implementation specialists. It's something that organizations are struggling because we've been trained to be in a function in finance, marketing, and project management brings that transversality. If we add the strategic component, then we can be very successful. So this is something that we see. The speed of change, you were talking, Saadi, the need to have that agility in the organization to adapt to change. You didn't need that 50 years the way you need it now. The way we're changing is so fast that we're expecting that the next 10 years we're going to see more change than in the past 250. So you cannot imagine how difficult this is from a strategic point of view, making decisions where to focus and then implement. And we can discuss about that in the Q&A. I want to go to the point of the polls. This one we saw the other day, the shift between day-to-day activities or the fixed part of the business towards a changing, fluid part of the business. Al was talking about that too yesterday. This is a different game. This is a different way to organize yourself, different skills, different KPIs, different performance indicators and revenues, and everything is different. So we'll see a big change there. A good friend of Mark and myself, Roger Martin, he actually thinks that 80 to 90% of the jobs in senior management are not functions. Even if they call them VP of marketing or VP of sales, they are 80% of their time working on projects, strategic initiatives, portfolio management, doing these kind of things. They don't call it because we're not there yet, but actually their work is focusing on strategy and implementation. And here we go to the pool. So asking to the audience, which I know is very smart from last time we talked, what percentage of strategies are successfully implemented today? This is according to a research done by my partner, Robin Speculant, but Bryland was coming with the similar figures too. So, Saadi, do we open the poll?
Yeah, I opened the poll and we find the numbers are still dancing. I'd like to ask everybody not to put your answer inside the chat box, please. Okay, answer to the right within the special place where you can select so that your answer can be part of this statistic. Thank you. So I'm ending the poll now, and it says around 16%, 50%, more than 80%, 8%, and around 40%, 40%. So, Antonio, your call.
The right answer is C, about 16%, between 10 and 20%, depending on the statistics, HBR, you have Brightline, of course, and then Bridges. So about 60%, between 10 and 20%. Maybe I think we can comment on the why this is such a poor result. I'm sure Mark has some views.
Yeah, well, I think when I started to look at and seriously study the subject, because it as a chief executive officer and in prior senior roles, it was something we had to deal with consistently, which is why weren't we achieving, or even achieving as much as we wanted to strategically as we set out to. And there's many reasons. And I'll start with the first, which most executives don't think about. So you just imagine a boardroom, anywhere in the world, maybe in the Middle East, and everyone's sitting around the table. The chief strategy officer's just delivered the presentation. Everyone's on board with the strategy, and everyone leaves the room. It's approved, and everyone leaves the room. Most of the executives in that room assume that there's someone or some group that's going to implement this strategy. But we know that connection doesn't exist. The chief strategy officer is rarely the individual, if at all, responsible for implementing that strategy. Instead, it goes into the general managers of the business. It goes into portfolios. Maybe if you're lucky, you have a PMO as a delivery authority, or maybe an enterprise PMO that has some accountability, but typically not at a very senior level, enough to influence the strategy, maybe to offer changes to the direction based on what we're learning. So for me, the biggest gap is when the strategy's development, or actually not the biggest, but the earliest gap is when the strategy is developed, is it articulated in a way that it can be implemented by the organization, and have the leaders, in particular those that develop the strategy, assess the organization for its ability to implement, because strategy is new and different. It's change. So if you're going to implement change, and it's implied to be very significant change, have you assess the organization what is necessary in this new state to implement the strategy? Because typically your organization, as was mentioned earlier, is aligned functionally, it's aligned to the core business that exists today, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're going to chart a path towards a new and different organization, you have to assess the ability to implement that strategy. And I think that one of the biggest challenges starts at the very beginning. Once that strategy is approved and the organization goes about the business of implementing it, it may have skipped a couple really significant and important steps.
Very interesting.
Great. Maybe just complementing what Mark says, I 100% agree, obvious, with Mark. I think one of the biggest constraints I see when implementing strategies, often there's too many strategies or they're not clear. So people prefer to play 10 coins in the roulette instead of just one. You spread a bit the risk, but you're not going to be successful. So the courage to choose one instead of 10, it's missing. And that, I think, it's why so many fails, because you go for 10 and maybe one you achieve part of it, but the rest you miss. So I see often companies which are more focused, laser focused, they tend to be more successful.
Let me add something here that I've seen a lot. Many public organizations, they revert to international companies to help them in crafting their strategy. And as much as they do something nice and something that pleases those in power and shows the amazing achievements they will achieve during their rule period they rule with, as much as they get paid and they are happy, until the people on the ground who were not equipped with the right capabilities, capacity building, right change mechanisms, are required to implement things that are alien, with a big gap in the implementation, something that was not actually tested for readiness and for the resource requirements and other things, and they get other organizations to implement. So everybody starts to do the over the fence thing. It's your fault, no, it's my fault. You did not craft it properly. No, you were not able to implement it properly, and things get lost a lot in this space.
And I think that's one of the symptoms, Saadi, that I was referring to as the leadership, that very earliest moment when the people responsible for developing the strategy actually check on the organization and take accountability over implementing the strategy. And typically you see symptoms as you described, which is, blaming other counterparts in the organization, blaming some external force that they did or did not anticipate, and somehow that's at fault, versus taking accountability for having the right organization in place to implement and anticipate the changes and external influences that may ultimately impact the success. And you think it'd be common, but it's often rare of that level of accountability. Instead, organizations shift to the next new thing, the next shiny object that comes in or is raised, in a meeting or by a customer or by, some market influence, and they turn to Antonio's point, they turn their focus and discipline away from what they said they wanted to achieve, and suddenly they're on a parallel path, perhaps, if not a divergent path, and working at odds with the strategy that was actually approved. So it's a challenge in organizations because people are very busy and they can lose focus and discipline and ultimately lose track of the strategy that they were trying to implement, even with all the elaborate dashboards and KPIs.
Yeah, quite true. Yeah.
Next poll.
Yes, next poll. This is the answer. Okay, next poll.
So what percentage of leaders are good at both crafting and implementing the strategy? Oh, sorry, I see the answer there. It's
no. They don't see the answer.
Okay.
They don't. See, okay. They don't see it.
Okay.
But we see the answer, Antonio.
We see.
Yes.
I think they're on to you, though. I'm looking at the poll. I think they're on to your strategy here in your polling questions.
Okay, so let's end it. So, Antonio, 67% say 8% A, and 27% say B, 24, and only 4% look at 48%. So 2/3 gave the answer A.
Which is the correct answer. So very, very well done. Again, these are just statistics. So there are some very good leaders that can do both, but based on HBR, only 8% of leaders are good at crafting and implementing. And I think this is translating in very important to the project management profession. I think this is, are we better at planning or are we better at implementing? And what do we need to do to leverage and be good at both? We need to be good planners, but good and excel at implementation. I think this is a good relation to what we see in this poll. Anything, Saadi, Mark, from your side?
Yeah, from my side, one thing I'd point out is, really there are two different roles, and just as other roles in the organization are different, there's a set of skills and behaviors that are necessary to be successful. And since we're both very passionate about projects, project economy that's come out of PMI began in my last year. Your work in the Project Revolution, one of your more recent books. We know that the project are the future, And when you think about that, I'll go back into the project to give you almost an analogous example of why two different roles one doesn't necessarily assure the other if you're good at it. So when we did a research around project sponsor, so a key role in your canvas, but also in successive project management or projects, we found that having been a project manager before did not make you any more likely to be a successful project sponsor. So think about it. Just because you knew how to be a good project manager didn't mean you would be a good project sponsor. So instead, what the research showed was an excellent project sponsor has the ability to micromanage the project, but not the tendency to micromanage the project, right? So they allow the team to do and achieve what they can do, but staying out of that at the appropriate level. And I think this is a great example of your question, because it just takes it up to another level. The chief strategy officer of the strategy team, who may be excellent at developing strategy, but there's this other role that's neglected, as I offered a while back, the implementation role, and why they need to focus more on the skills and behaviors of the individuals that are accountable for and working in projects to implement the change in the strategy.
Yes, Mark, having said that, there's always a question in my mind for the past 10 years. We have lots of content, the PIM book and other guidelines that speak about project manager and the attributes and the skills and competencies required from a project manager. But we rarely see anything, a standard or a certification that states what a sponsor is and what certification he should have, if any, or the attributes. We find it scattered here and there. But we need it. We found lots of statistics and research shows that perhaps the contribution of a sponsor is of great value to the success or failure of any project. Yet we always focus on the technical aspect rather than on the more strategic or organizational aspect of project success.
No, it's a great observation. I know I was in a meeting of about 80 leaders of organizations, specifically at the enterprise PMO level or executives that were responsible. And I think perhaps a third of them had actually even defined the role of project sponsor in their organization, let alone gone on to, say, train and develop or put them through a curriculum to make them the best sponsor possible. So it is a gap. And the Bright Line Initiative was to take that on, and may still. I'm no longer familiar with the pipeline of what they're working on at that level, but there's a need, and that gap needs to be filled.
Maybe a last observation from my side. I think most of the education it's going into the crafting, the planning, the concrete stuff, and very few things are taught on the implementation. I did a survey years ago about how many MBAs teach project management, seen as implementation, and just 2 out of the top 100. So everybody's taught on the concrete, on the things that we know, which is the crafting, the planning, and there is a big gap on the other side.
Yeah.
Next
okay.
one, 8%.
Next one. So
what
next
percentage of people can articulate the organization strategy? Saadi, this is a piece of cake for you.
Okay, last question. Actually, they were able to see. It's my mistake. But this question, nobody's able to see. And the answers are, yes. The answers are 65% A, said 5%. And 35% said 35%. And only 1% said 55%.
Mark, what do you think?
Is 1% an option?
It could be. Why is that, Mark? Why is such a little 5%?
Well, it's funny. I think from an organization standpoint, there's so much legacy in terms of culture, communication, how functions are thought of. And if you go back, if you look at any, or most, I should say, org structures today, they're still very functionally aligned. It's the work that you do, and even into the education system. When we go seek our degrees, we're entering into almost a functional education system. You're going to be in marketing or finance or engineering, and when you come back into the workforce, you find the same thing. The org structure is still very functional. Even if you run and operate in a matrixed environment, it's still not where it needs to go to be successful in the project economy and the project revolution, because it requires much more. And I think we'll probably get to that a little bit later. And the other reason, as I mentioned earlier, some strategies are not really developed in a way that can be articulated clearly to the organization, and the organization fails to take that step. I remember, the old marketing adage, you need to tell everyone 7 times before they understand it or get the message. And I had a panel with a global engineering company, a CEO, and several others, and we were having the same discussion. And his comment was, "Mark, I think it's no longer 7 times. I think it's 1,000 times." And that requires a lot of effort and the willingness and the commitment to communicate on an ongoing basis with your organization. And most people don't have the energy or the commitment, or even if they begin, they get fatigued and they turn their focus and discipline again, Antonio, to something else. And I think that's a real challenge in the organization, because if you're going to go through a transformation or launch a completely new enterprise strategy, or at least some part, communication has to be at the top of the list. And it begins with having a strategy that actually can be communicated. And finally, one other more recent example, I was in a room I was talking about that this topic was PMOs, and I still believe that the PMO must be disrupted itself into what I call the Office of Strategy Delivery as an initial label for it. And one of the things that I considered at that point was, how do we get the portfolio of projects and programs closer to the strategy in the organization? And likewise, how do we get the strategy into the hands of those that are implementing it on a routine basis, so that they may have gotten a presentation on day 1, but by day 60 or 120, so much has happened in the implementation internally, but also externally, that you really need a more routine and systematic way to communicate that strategy. And I believe shifting the Office of the PMO, as an example, to the Office of Strategy Delivery, and bringing in keeping all the things that are successful, of course, shedding the things that aren't successful in PMOs, but bringing in really more senior and higher level accountabilities and connection to those that have developed the strategy. And I think that has to happen. And the feedback I got, again, from about 60 to 80 executives in the room, was that's one of the things they see missing in PMOs is really the opportunity to have insight and input into the strategy as it's being implemented.
Now, I can relate to one thing. In Saudi Arabia, the government, to realize their Vision 2030, they instilled what they named as a Vision Realization Office. And the PMO follows or reports to the Vision Realization Office. And they started to implement these concepts. Now, since this is a new thing, and like all the new things anybody tries to implement, there is a lot of learning in the beginning. In some cases, maybe some have done it right. In other cases, not necessarily the VROs I'm talking about, they utilize portfolio to manage projects. In this perspective, they put the portfolio under the PMO. And this defeats the purpose, because the portfolio is there to realize the strategy through using both operations and projects. Okay, projects, they produce new value, and operations, they realize this value. It takes 2 to tango. We need both for our organization to grow and to sustain. So I believe there are lots of interesting concepts that are not widely spread, especially to the people upstairs, such as really implementing portfolio in the right sense changes a lot of things.
And maybe just what I've seen Mark in action when I was the chair of PMI and Mark was the CEO, and I can say Mark is on that 5%. When he was leading PMI, I can think very, very focused organization. Everybody, after a few days of having decided the strategy, knew what the strategy was. So Mark, I just can say great things about your leadership in this respect on engaging your senior leadership team and the levels below and keeping simple and focused. And I think for me, you are a great example on making this work.
Well, I used 999 times. I didn't really need 1,000, but I got close to 1,000 in terms of communicating. But we put in a rigorous approach to communicating. Combination of very formal monthly meetings, informal every week Tuesday mornings, and then we used all the global offices and 12,000 plus volunteers at PMI. Made sure we connected with them. And I can say that it is a significant, almost Herculean effort, but it paid dividends, Antonio, as you saw. And there was no one in the organization that didn't have the opportunity to hear about the strategy and what we were doing on a very routine basis and frequent basis. So the one thing I'd say, I like the model that you talked about in terms of the value and vision realization. And I think there's other groups that follow a similar, like the Olympics, where they can do a delivery authority and it's very specific to that one event. But when you're talking about a country or a company, it takes some real leadership. And I think the nature of the leader changes. So not just those implementing, so not program, project, and portfolio managers, not just functional leaders. All those are important too. But I think the leadership at the very senior level has to be different, has to have a different set of skills and behaviors. And one of them obviously is communication. We talked about that. But your role changes from like a kind of directing the organization to really connecting the organization. You go from more of an integrative behavior than a directive behavior. So you're integrating the various parts of the organization, both on the project side, but also on the business as usual operational side, because they're still part of the strategy as well. I mean, the strategy includes both, which, by the way, in the PMOs, they rarely have visibility to the portfolio of other than the project portfolio. And they don't get to see the rest of the organization. And maybe if they did, they'd have a different resource view than they do as among other reasons for project failure. But that's a different story. We're on strategy implementation today.
Yeah, you're just talking about my first topic, breaking organizational silos and integrated lifecycle management framework. I'm happy you raised the topic of integration and collaboration. This is actually the core of it. Yeah. Good. So, move on, Antonio.
Last poll. This is an easy one.
Okay.
Is it better to take the wrong action or not action at all?
The answer is C, take the right action.
Well, maybe, Mark, nowadays, nobody knows the C in the COVID or post-COVID, okay? There are things that are unknown. We are barely fighting and thinking and brainstorming, trying to know the right questions. We are not at the answers yet. I don't know. So, ending the poll, we have 80% saying wrong action, and yes, and 19% or 20% saying no action.
And this is correct. It's, again, this is just a poll, but usually it's better to take action. And if you're wrong, you can adjust and learn from it. So, and the same goes into the direction of shifting from strategy crafting to implementation. Implement, and maybe you learn if you fail and adjust. And so everything is shifting towards let's try, let's do it, let's push it, and we'll learn from that and we'll get better next time. That's how this question is built. Anything to comment, Mark, Saadi?
Go ahead, Saadi.
Okay. I'm always for doing something rather than standing still. And I believe this is the core of the agile mindset, which is instead of spending a lot of effort and time planning on something that, especially where there are lots of ambiguities and everything is gray, maybe it's better to plan a bit and move a little bit ahead. If we discover that this is the wrong action, we can go and say, like Edison said, I never made a wrong choice. I learned 5,000 or 6,000 times how not to make a lamp. Okay. Or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar when in the basketball or others, that nobody just succeeds like this by hitting it on from the first time every time. It does not happen except in La La Land. Okay. We have to make mistakes to learn from them.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, we all know that action is better than inaction, because you're most assured not to be successful if you do nothing, because the competition or those that you serve will be expecting some change, and you won't be able to deliver it. I'll give you a really quick, great example of why you need to act and then learn from that action. So you think about when these websites, community, like things like Facebook and others came out there. I was talking to some executives in theirs. I won't name them because it was done under Chatham House rule, but they had all the research. They said, this is what the customers want. Those we're going to serve, volumes of research where they asked over and over in different ways, surveys, focus groups, beta tests. And the customer said, this is what we want. And then they went out and they launched the website, and none of the behaviors matched the research. So they had to change all their algorithms to what they actually did on the website versus what the profile they elected on the website. And suddenly the success and the revenue began to accelerate to now where they're a very successful organization. I mean, not the biggest, they're not Facebook or anyone like that, but they're very successful and ultimately sold out to someone else. But think about it, the research was well done by leading firms, and it said, this is what our customers want. They did exactly that. If they hadn't changed and checked along the way, they would have implemented 100% and failed, and likely spent all the capital that they had raised and had to go back out for rounds and dilute the value of the shareholders and so on. But they were able to adapt, change the algorithms, and be successful. I mean, I think that's just a really quick example. Now, if you do that at the enterprise level, at a large organizations, 100 billions of sales, it might be a little bit different, but I think the same concept is valid, and I think that's what leaders need to focus on.
Okay, interesting. Now, I have a question, and this question is about strategy implementation. Now, I believe the 5% and the low numbers, or 8%, these were statistics collected or data collected before COVID-19. What do you think strategy implementation status and situation is during this COVID-19, which nobody knows when it will end, and after it ends, because it will end, okay, hopefully it ends before us, what would be the status of the strategy implementation? So these are two questions, the same question, but two phases. Let's assume from now until end of 2020, and then 2021 forward, hopefully no pandemic then.
Yeah, so I'll start it off, Antonio, if you don't mind. So as I think about strategy implementation, and although I have to admit that COVID-19 is beyond any pandemic that I had envisioned, when I was leading PMI, we used scenario planning that was created by Royal Dutch Shell, and we had actually included pandemic in some of the scenarios after H1N1 and some of the other kind of more minor now it appears to be pandemics. So the scale of what's happened and the shutting down of organizations and economies and social distancing, and is well beyond, I think, what I had envisioned. But I think the reality is, having gone through kind of post 9/11, post global financial crisis, and watched what organizations did during those times, during and after, two things I'd say is most leading organizations recognize that in the crisis, there's more opportunity to gain, I'll just say broadly, market share or make progress if you're more of a mission-based organization during the crisis. Because if you're a strong organization, well capitalized, you can continue to compete and implement the strategy. And when the crisis clears, whenever that is, or it gets down to some new level, which will be my second point, you'll be in a more favorable position than those that you compete with, or on behalf of those you serve, if you're a not-for-profit or a government entity. So more about value for money. And I think the second thing I'd say is, in each of those crises that we've all gone through, and including this one, you're beginning to hear the new normal again, the language around the new normal. What's the new normal? When are we going to achieve the new normal? And I think I said this after the global financial crisis when I was interviewed in various publications, I think it's time that organizations, and especially individuals involved in strategy and leading the organizations, give up on the idea of a new normal, because I don't think there is a new normal. And some of the smart leading organizations that put out a lot of thought leadership are starting to say that now, right? They're starting to talk about the next normal, or at IBM, a different normal. And I think that's getting closer, but it's not close enough. And I think what it really needs to happen is organizations, getting back to the project economy, project revolution, they need to recognize that they're going to be forever faced with some disruption. Some of it's going to be monumental, like the pandemic, and on a scale that maybe you hadn't fully envisioned. But if you build an organization using some of the structures that we've discussed, having capable people, not only in the development of strategy, but also in the implementation with the right skills and behaviors. I mentioned integrative. That's critical. The ability to communicate is critical. Curiosity is one of the least appreciated traits in, I think, some of the most successful people that I've worked with, because they're always out there looking for ways to improve whatever they're responsible for. So I think, yes, we're dealing with very disruptive time. We can talk about or speak about looking for the next normal or a different normal. But I think as organization leaders, we need to build an organization that can thrive in any disruption and is prepared for it. It becomes part of its DNA. It's not something we have to ramp up only to see ramp down. And then whenever the next event comes along, say, wow, what's the new normal after this? And we ramp up again to deal with the challenges that it presents. So they're the two things I'd say to start it off.
Okay, thank you. Great.
What I can add to that, what I've been reflecting, is that in before the crisis, strategy implementation was for medium to long term. Where do we want? And now, because we had the machine, we was producing the money, the running of the organization that was running. With the crisis, the machine has stopped. So I think strategy implementation goes a big part towards how can we fix our business right now? So it's more about taking short-term strategic decisions on what do we do to survive? Do we shift everything online? If you're a training company, and you know that, Saadi, you are doing a lot of training. From 0 to 100% in a week, you need to be training online. So it requires strategy implementation has a big component on the short-term fixing and making sure you survive. It's about survival. Once you pass that, then you need to have piece of the strategy implementation, thinking about the near term, the next year, what's going to happen, how are we going to do? And then actually also looking at the opportunities that Mark is talking, because these are opportunities to pivot the business. You've been thinking about being digital forever. I've been teaching in business schools forever. Everything switched in a week. So what are the other opportunities that we can leverage? But there is a huge urgency to focus strategy implementation on the now, because we need to get people back to work. We need to get customers. We need to get the trust. And this is, for me, the big difference that I see now. And of course, agree with Mark what he's saying. The norm, it will be constant change, constant disruption. That's why we need more strategy implementation specialists.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, because I assume there's those that are responsible in organizations or in their own organization, helping educate and train the workforce that we're speaking about. If you go back 20 years ago or so, I was at another conference. I'm on an advisory board of a different conference, and their focus is leadership in the digital age. And I was moderating a panel, and it came up that the skills development cycle is dramatically different than it was 20 years ago. So where before you had 2 years to gain skills, 6 years to use them, and then you start over again, that's completely gone. And the individual that was on the panel said he didn't know what the exact cycle was, and I don't either. But I suspect that it's closer to 2 months, 6 months to use, and then you need to go acquire the next set of skills or the next level of the same skills on this more routine constant basis, because organizations are going to face this going forward. And if you want to be successful in an organization, you have to be ready to adapt on that type of schedule and pace. Every 2 years you're gaining a new skill, or at least the next level of that skill. You're applying it, you're learning, you're coming back and getting the next. And I think that's those that will be most successful have adapted an approach to development, their own personal development, hopefully supported by the organization. But if not, to Antonio's point, there's plenty of things out there online that'll be able to help them achieve that.
I think, Mark, you reminded me of who moved my cheese. I think it's time to put on our running shoes, and we can never let them go again. Okay, in order, as Antonio said, to survive. This is important. Another thing, based on what you both said, I believe strategy implementation should be very near from strategy crafting or making, especially in these critical months to survive. Okay, you cannot have a steering board or committee that governs from a very high place with lots of levels downstairs to the people who realize. They should be almost the same group, or only one level between them, speaking together in the morning, in the afternoon, and after 12 a.m. at night every day. What are we going to do tomorrow? Okay, so this blends sort of strategy and operations management into maybe in the same blender, at least during the first period of fighting and surviving the pandemic. Now, because there are two types of organizations. Many organizations were weak. They had the money, as Antonio said, okay, because they were doing the same thing they used to do for the past 20 years. Okay, but suddenly it stopped, and they found themselves cut off. They need to redefine themselves or business or phase out. And there are others in the middle who are not that strong, but they have a sense they need to move on quickly, be extremely adaptive, extremely agile, okay, think and act and make mistakes and then correct the mistakes the other day. No time to wait, okay, in order to survive. Yeah, this is what I've seen. I've seen lots of teams. They are extremely flexible. Lots of the people who used to inside the organization say no, or pose resistance. No, they are more realistic. Okay, we need to survive, and we can only do this together.
Nothing to add. I think there's a lot of questions. I was seeing a lot of questions. Yeah, I don't know.
Let's start with the questions. Okay, let's start with the questions. Okay, so I'm gonna start with the last one I saw. So, what do you think the role of a strategist in an organization? If only 5% then understand the strategy at the end of the day, are some people being paid for nothing?
I'm not sure I would go that far, but so I believe it's, certainly the chief executive officer, whatever their title is, managing director, CEO. I think ultimately the accountability is there for them to decide on the roles. I think that there's a great post-mortem story on a CEO of a very large company, and one of the 3 reasons they said that the CEO wasn't successful and ultimately the board removed was that she failed to assess, I mentioned this earlier, assess the organization's ability to implement the strategy. And so I would take that, to the point of the role of the chief strategy officer, there has to be an assessment, not just an assessment, as to the organization's ability. We know we can look at the types of people we have, the skills, competencies, behaviors that they have. Are we, certainly on the capital side, that's a little bit more factual in terms of whether we have the financial resources to do it. But you have to look at the human resources too. But that's not enough. I mentioned it earlier. I believe there needs to be a role or a group of roles that are those that come back and report on and are accountable for the implementation of the strategy. And that doesn't often happen. And so I think the chief strategy officer is probably paid to do what they've always been asked to do, which is develop the strategy. If the organization wants to have them be accountable for implementation, I'm not sure that that's the appropriate thing, because it's often difficult to govern what you've created. That's why we have boards of directors and trustees who are not the ones developing the strategy. They're holding those that did accountable. So I think we need to look into the organization. And I think since strategy is change and projects and programs are change, driving strategic change, all strategic change happens through projects and programs. I think the place we need to look is in the organization where the projects and programs are being implemented, and formalize that role there. And I think each organization can be different as it needs to. Context matters, but right now it doesn't exist. I mean, I think we should have another poll, which is how many, PMOs, whatever you call them, in your organization are actually responsible, deemed and noted responsible for implementing strategy. And I don't think we'd get to 1% or 2% in that poll if we had one.
Yeah.
Now there are many questions, but I was able to see 3 relates to the strategy implementation certificate. Okay, you did not speak about it. We leave it till the end. Okay, maybe after taking some questions. Some are asking, does it include influencing? And another question, do you think training is enough? Okay, and a third question, what are the main tools for strategy implementation? So I would like to address all these 3 together as one question to Antonio, please.
Sure, Saadi, great questions. And this is something we've been thinking a lot before putting together the professional certification around strategy implementation. So there's a framework that we provide, called the roadmap, strategy implementation roadmap, 7 components like culture, like employee engagement, like leadership execution. So you see, it's a complementary to what we know from the PMP and the program management, the portfolio management. So they're all complementary areas. It's a vanilla approach. So we're just trying to build the basis, understanding of implementation. And then the training is enough for that, but then you will be working with people like us, with Saadi, to coach you and your teams to get better. So training is not enough. It's the first step. Certification gives you the credibility. You pass the exam so that you will be recognized. But it does require some mentoring and coaching and workshops along to get better. And I think that's what we're trying to build here. It's just the basis, the fundamental that everybody understands what we're talking about strategy implementation. And so we're going to share a little bit more about the framework, but I got already very good feedback because it's light, but it's complementary. We talk about meaning tools, balanced scorecard. Of course, we talk about that, but we talk about other frameworks. So it's just a good scanning of the implementation environment, the key tools, and how you can get better by using them and learning them. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I have a question of my own.
Wait, is that allowed?
Well,
Go ahead,
in
please, I'm sorry.
the COVID-19, many things are allowed. Okay. I was thinking about one thing. Now, you both are international leaders, and you gain much of your credibility through working with PMI. I myself, I have lots of certifications, and I have been a registered education provider, and I've served here and there with PMI. PMI is our family. And we have over 1 million in the world who have the PMP. We do train PMP. When I looked at this new certification about strategy implementation, I found that it is not the same as the PMP. So I did not see it as a replacement for the PMP. I believe it is a place, again, I talked about connecting temporary and permanent. We utilize the permanent projects to achieve we utilize the temporary to achieve strategy, which is something permanent. Perhaps it is a link between those who have PMP and top management to help realize the value, the benefits, and turn them into the organization to realize this strategy. Maybe is my understanding correct?
Correct, Saadi. This is complementary. It's not competing at all with PMI. It's not, maybe we compete a bit with the balanced scorecard if they have the certification, but it's complementary. I think, of course, people need to get the PMP, and if they want the program management and the portfolio, this is just a nice addition, an umbrella to make you understand a bit bigger picture. But it builds on the knowledge that we all have from the PMP, which is irrepressible. Nobody will ever compete with PMP thanks to what Mark has been doing for years. This is a great place to build. So no, there is no competition. It's complementary. I always talk, I have lots of PMs working for me as director of PMO, and they say, what's next for me? I don't like Agile. I want to learn some Agile ways of methods, but I don't want to do IT Agile. What's next for me? Should I go to an MBA? Well, that's 2 years, big investment. There was nothing else. So we're trying to fill that gap for people who have been doing 10 years project management or PMO or portfolio management. They want to get an edge to get broader into a management position, leadership position, and that's it. But absolutely no doubt that there's no competition with PMI. It's complementary. The fact that we partner with APMG is because the situation came like that. It was, I think PMI is going through a transformation and they could not focus everywhere. And APMG just saw the opportunity, saw the gap that Mark, you see in the market. So it's just a partnership for 3 years, and then we'll see.
Yeah, the way if I could add to that, since your question also included the PMP, I think what organizations to be successful in your current COVID environment, post COVID, whatever the next disruptor is really what they're looking for is not agile project management. I mean, they'll use that, but what they're really looking for is organization agility. And I think the strategy implementation institute and this certification is really taking those like PMPs that and enable them to be more valuable at the organization agility level, which we know includes things other than just agile project management practices. That's one of them. PMI's own research on organization agility included that, and it wasn't even in the top 5 of 10. Agile practices were in the second half of 10, but in the front end was things like voice of the customer, shorter review and decision-making cycles. These things are critical, and that's within projects, but it's also at the enterprise or the organization level. And I think anything we can do to bring those types of skills, behaviors, and recognition through formal certification will go a long way to helping those that are involved in projects and programs, be more successful in the organization, and hopefully at a more senior level. And when Antonio first approached me about this, one of the things I was reminded of is an interview I did with a very large global publication, and they were trying to get me to say that MBAs in schools were not successful because those that came out couldn't actually implement anything in the organization. And of course I was well trained in public relations by my team, so they said, you can't answer that question. Answer a different question. But the reality is, I don't know that that's true or not. I mean, I think it largely depends on the individual and and all the other skills and behaviors they have versus what they learned in MBA school. But there's clearly a gap, and there's a gap in other roles. So this is aimed at filling that gap, helping them be more successful in implementing plans at any level, hopefully at the strategic level, but at any level. And I think that that's necessary today. It was necessary a decade ago, and I think it'll be necessary a decade from now.
One thing that I'd like to note, I believe PMI in the past 10 years became much more stronger, and I believe they are becoming even more stronger now. It reminds me with the book From Good to Great. Great organizations, they have several CEOs who are all great and all successful. It does not stop or end when a great leader leaves, okay? And this is part of their power. I believe I don't know Sunil personally, but I'm seeing transformation, and I'm seeing lots of agility, lots of adaptation, lots of hearing the voice of the customer, lots of engagements, and I believe this is making the community even working closely with PMI. I believe this is also part of their success. And as you said, I think it's very much complementary to the PMP.
Yeah.
Now, having said this, our original time will end in a minute. Nevertheless, I need you, please, Antonio, to explain and elaborate a little bit about the certification, one thing, and then afterwards, if you like to stay, because we have 281 people with us, we can extend the time if your time allows to take more questions. Are you able to stay more with us, Mark?
I can. Yep.
Okay, Antonio.
Yeah, I'm used to your webinars that never.
Okay. So then let us go back to the presentation only for 5 minutes or 6 minutes. I would like you to explain more, please, about the certification. Then we go back to take some of the questions, because I see streams of questions. I don't know what we'll do with all of them. So
I'll be very brief, Saadi. I'm sure you will send this when you send the recording, so you can share a couple of my slides. This one we can skip. This is some mindsets about implementation. This one we can skip. And Mark, you recognize the talent triangle that you define it. This is just the overview of the website, which is with a clear purpose. I think our purpose is to develop leaders around the world to be specialists and succeed in strategy implementation. That's what we want. That's all. And this is what we've been discussing so far. This is the roadmap, which is a framework that we've built. And my partner is Robin Speculan. He's one of the experts in Asia, and he works in the Middle East around implementation. He has been 15 years already, multiple books and research. And so we built this together. You see there's 7 modules: leadership excellence, financial value, the value creation, the business models, the agility of business models, the stakeholder management, cultural evolution, employee engagement, and track performance. So this is what you will learn when you go through the online course. It's all break into 4 phases: crafting, embedding, executing, and sustaining. So there's that. The beauty about this framework is that you can start anywhere. So this is not a plan. It's just like life. Nowadays, business go on up and down and restart. So this is the framework. The certification is accredited by APMG. Besides PMI, APMG is the other big certification provider. So I think that's top quality, everything online. It has been tested, it has been prototyped. So it's state of the art, is well recognized. That's what we wanted. We wanted a strong partner, worldwide recognition, so that when you're certified, hopefully in the future, it can see as a nice addition to your PMP or PMGMP. So that's what you will find. And you can read this when we share. The last, I think, big announcement, we are having some special promotion for the launch. So all the prices are discounted by 50%, and there's an extra discount when you use advisor as the code. So we'll share with you the link. The course can take between 5 days to 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depending on your pace. It's fully online. And then you just need to book for the exam in APMG. 70 questions, 1 hour. You need to get 49 correct to get the pass and the certification. But that's, I think, to keep it briefly, people will be able to read it. Saadi, I want to move into the questions. I think that's where we can take advantage of Mark being here with us.
Okay. One last thing, just a reminder that next week, next Wednesday, at 9 p.m. KSA, we have Emotional Intelligence with Dr. Radia Ben Alia. For those who like to register, I just show you the link down that you can use, and we'll send it to you with our next communication. So go back to the questions. Okay, first of all, I'd like to start by apologizing because we'll not be able to take all. Somebody's saying, I'm trying to read, but they are coming and they start to move. Strategy objectives. Somebody's writing strategy objectives of a PMO, and it must be aligned with my company. What tool, techniques, or reference you recommend? So maybe it's to project or projectize the strategy of an organization to that of the PMO. You'd like to?
Sure. I think so. A couple of things. One is it's interesting that you're being asked to write the strategic objectives of the PMO, presumably by someone or some group that you report to. Because it highlights what I see as often, not so much now, but in the early days of PMOs, which is many organizations heard about them. It was more of a grassroots, kind of bottoms up, organization. So many project managers looking for a way to be more effective, efficient, deliver better value and results. So they convinced the organization to have a PMO, and the organization doesn't quite know why they have a PMO. And it reminded me of a large technology and content organization. Again, Chatham House rule, can't name them, but we're talking about effectiveness and PMOs. And at the very end, one of the individuals in the meeting said, "Can I speak to you for a second?" And by the way, their project success rate was less than 20%. They told me, and this is company's number one in its industry at the time. They may not be anymore, but and so they said that he pulled me aside. He said, "I just want to let you know, I was tasked with implementing the enterprise PMO, but I really don't understand it. I don't know why we needed it, but I implemented it." So I hope that's not your circumstance. So, but now I'll try and answer the part about what should you do, what tools can you use. So I think the first practice that I would have, and there's lots of good examples of it in organizations, is try and connect as your sponsors. And I don't know the title structure within your organization, but the general managers of the business units. So try and develop sponsorship for the PMO at a strategic objective level with the general managers. And one of the great examples, I'm not sure it's on PMI's website anymore, but IBM, when they formed their organization structure, the sponsors of the center of excellence in IBM are the general managers of the business units. So when it comes to writing things like strategic objectives, they have a direct connection, and they're responsible for delivering value, and they have to essentially renew that on an annual basis. They have to convince the general managers that they're still delivering the value that was desired. So I think that's one way, which is connect to some type of executive level sponsor around that. And the other would be to use strategy cascading type tools, but I'm not sure that would be effective unless you had the input and support of those that you're ultimately going to be accountable to. So.
Yeah, many PMOs fail perhaps because, as you said, they are not sponsored well. The organization does not know the value. And I always ask my colleagues or partners or clients, does your company ever think of shutting down their IT or their finance or accounting or HR business units? They said, no, we cannot continue the business. Do they ever think about shutting the PMO? They say yes, all the time. And this gets us to the point that the sponsor does not know why they should have a PMO in the first place. And this is the place to start from, perhaps.
Yeah. PMI had significant research in many areas, but I remember and this is a little bit dated, but one of the earliest PMO research pieces said that it takes an average of 6 months to 18 months to stand up a PMO, and they have an average life cycle of about 3 years before they dissolve, only later to come back and be, kind of reborn in maybe a different name, but under different sponsorship. And I think that's a challenge that probably sounds like it's still going on today because the organizations don't truly understand what it represents, or it's not well defined. And I think that's at least the role of the leader of the PMO to make sure it's well defined.
Okay. Now there is a question.
Yes. Because I've been running PMOs for years, but I think there's the PMO, which is a back office role, the reporting, the getting data to make reports. Those are doomed to fail. In 3 years, they're out, like Mark saying. There's the more coaching PMO, which is about building skills, career development. Those might stand, but people will not see the value. I think PMOs need to evolve towards what Mark was saying, and you study a more strategy implementation office where you help management decide which projects to invest, make choices, prioritization. That's where we actually bring the top value, is forcing management to be focused, to take decisions, to stop projects that are not working, to building teams cross organization, like you said some weeks ago. So it's really becoming more like a consulting source of knowledge, challenging the executives and the project leaders. And that's where you thrive. That's the future of PMOs for the long term, I think. I've seen.
Yeah, it's a beautiful answer. I love both your answers. Now there is a question about, okay, there's this company and they have a gap between their strategy and the capability and readiness. So what can they do to make it their strategy more applicable? Maybe they wanted to they say to chew more than they can eat. Okay. Yeah. They don't have enough capability and readiness to fulfill the strategy. So what do they do?
Well, as I said probably too many times already, I think it's one of the, I'll call it a failure of the strategy that was developed, not to recognize that early enough. But it's not too late. I mean, you can make modifications. And this is where the leadership piece in the implementation expert that Antonio is talking about, and how I articulated it in the talent triangle of PMI, this is where that negotiation, conflict resolution, organization change management, these capabilities that are not traditional project or program manager skills. It used to be more administrative, technical, budget management, schedule management, earned value management. This is where you get into that people and leadership area, and these leadership skills are essential. So hopefully you've developed them over time in your career, and now you have to have the confidence, and I believe confidence is an important key here, the confidence to go back I'll say up to the organization, because it sounds like it's still pretty hierarchical there, but at least go to the organizations making decisions about the strategy, what needs to be implemented, and see if you can negotiate a way to say, this part now, this part eventually, but not everything all at once, or we won't be successful. And I think that takes real negotiation skills, conflict resolution. I saw on the earlier slide, the woman is coming on emotional intelligence. The number one, it's not quite a skill, but the number one request I've seen in project management before, during, and after a crisis is emotional intelligence. And I think that's critical as well. Being able to use that to navigate an organization's complexities to help make the right decisions for success.
Okay. Now we have a question, interesting one, about metrics. Are there any metrics to track strategy implementation? Or how can we know that the implementation is on the right path? Okay, because I believe this is about the interim thing, because we will have the KPI for the strategy itself. Okay, but how do we know before we hit a wall, because we're not able to realize our strategy, that our strategy implementation is not good?
Yeah, so I think I'll go first, Antonio. I think you probably have some concrete examples as well, but I think that you're right. There's metrics and KPIs for the strategy. They're typically very high level, and they're probably more appropriately more market focused. So do we see the change and value created in the market? For me, you have to have a good solid set of external, outside in type metrics at the strategic level, and hopefully they exist. But when you're talking about interim assessment, I think you really need a set of metrics, because if you only look at one kind of perspective, or not quite a portfolio view, but a portfolio of metrics. If, for instance, you looked at the products that are inherent in the strategy, and did we achieve them, and how are they performing, I think you would miss other key parts of that transformation. And I always start with people, because I believe that having the right people with the right competency, skills, and behavior is ultimately going to assure that you achieve the strategy. And do you have a set of KPIs in the near term around how you're developing the people that you said you needed, the type of skills that they were supposed to have or achieve or develop? And so I think a set of views into KPIs and metrics that involve, what it is you're going to create unique. So this is something new and different. So it could be a product, it could be a service, with complementary outside in, inside out. So if we're on time and on budget, and if we met original scope, it may not have mattered if the external world didn't value it, right? So you have to have that balance of internal and external. And I think there's a competitive aspect. I mean, everyone's in competition with someone. Maybe it's not for profit, but government entities, not for profits, they're in competition with something. It might be expectations of those we serve, but we're still in competition with that expectation. And you need that view of that stakeholder group, the customer, those we serve, as a balanced set of those KPIs. And having said that, it clearly is more complicated and complex than an organization might want to take on, but it's essential to be successful. You have to have this set in place, and you have to have the support and buy-in from all those involved in implementing, which brings us back to things like integrative capabilities. Or as a leader, are you integrating the organization around these key aspects? Are you transparent? I think there was a question that kind of popped up earlier. Many organizations, you somewhat kind of fear to say you don't know, or getting it wrong is typically punished still. But if you're transparent, you're not intimidated into giving an answer that's wrong just because you don't want to say you don't know yet. I think all you have to do is say, I don't know, but I'll find out. Or we're not sure, but we'll know by this time in this way. And if we don't, we'll keep you updated because we're communicating regularly around our progress towards that. This is a very different role, even today, as connected as we are socially through technology and face-to-face, although interrupted right now. This is still not a very common role. And I think that's where, the project economy, the project revolution are going to force organizations to think less functionally, less hierarchically, and more on an integrative, enabling basis towards a greater common good for those we serve, and whatever the mission might be.
Antonio.
Well, I think it's all about also thinking about leading indicators. It's lagging indicators, things that we've seen on the KPIs, that if you see great leaders like the guy from Microsoft or Amazon, they are not so focused on the today KPIs because they know it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't represent the decisions that they need to take today. So it's having leading indicators. And I think Rita McGrath, seen around the corners, she provides extremely great examples on how can you look at the future, sense responses, sense trends. And I think that's where I believe KPIs of strategy implementation should go. Of course, there needs to be a return on investment and the company has to perform well, but it's also about your employee satisfaction and your customer, long-term engagement with the customer. So I think we'll see a shift from lagging KPIs to leading KPIs, which are more difficult to define.
Yep. Yeah. And more difficult to get support for because they're not as factual as, say, return on investment, where you can calculate it, or IRR, or whatever your metric is for that. And the other thing is important too, in the original business case of at the high level of the strategy, there's something that was assumed. We're going to achieve revenue growth of 30%, something like that. And so you can measure that. But I mentioned the outside-in perspective. So say you're in a sector such as, I don't know, engineering, procurement, construction, EPC, and you had a plan for your new strategy to grow 30%, and you grew 30%. That's great. But what if all your competitors grew 50% during the same time frame? If you don't have that outside perspective, you can be satisfied with what you've achieved, but the rest of the world could be accelerating well past you, but yet you still have this sense of success. Yeah. And so when I led PMI, we always looked at the competitive dashboard, even though we were not for profit. Were we missing anything? Were other organizations accelerating past us in anything that we had chose strategically to focus on? And I think that's an important part of leadership in that area.
Very interesting. By the way, yes.
No, I will need to leave. I need to put my kid to bed.
Okay. Okay. So by this, we will end our very interesting
You
session.
can go on. You can go on. There's 240 people. I don't know how you do it, Saadi, but I think you can do 24 hours marathon here.
Mark, how about your time? Would like to stay for 10 more minutes?
Yeah, a few more questions. Sure, absolutely.
You can. Okay. Mark is going to keep the show. I just want to say goodbye to everybody. Thank you, Saadi, for the opportunity. Mark, always a pleasure to work with you. Thank you to everybody, the great questions. I hope to see you soon in the strategy implementation, community certification. You'll find people like Mark, like Saadi, like Rita McGrath, who's in our board. And I think it is going to add a lot to our community and step up and capture that gap that we all talk about and much needed today. Thank you, Saadi. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody.
Yep. Thank you, Antonio.
We'll talk soon, Antonio. Yep.
Okay. Okay. Bye-bye, Antonio. Okay. So it gives us more space. So people
looks like
can
we're
see
shoulder to shoulder almost.
Yeah. So there is this question about strategy implementation entails risks, especially during transition. Sorry, I'm reading and
it's moving on you.
It moved and I can't catch the question anymore.
I think there was a note that said all questions were moved to the Q&A section, although I'm not sure where that is.
I think Mustafa should have it. QA mode. Okay. Let me search for it.
I like
Okay,
this comment. And then there were two. That was a good comment.
Okay. Is it safe to say that strategists must not only develop the strategy, but more sell it to the company's employees in order to effectively motivate the implementation?
Well, I certainly do. And I think whether it's the chief strategy officer or whoever has that role by whatever title, I believe it's an executive responsibility. So in my case, in the various executive roles that I had, I felt it was my obligation, my accountability, not only to sell it initially, but also to continue to communicate. It's very similar in a way to the project sponsor role, because one of the things a project sponsor should do is not just put their name on the sponsor document, but continually be out there advocating for the value of that project in the organization throughout its delivery and implementation. And I feel that the same as the chief executive or a chief strategy officer. It's your role not just to do it once, but all throughout. Whatever the duration of the change and transformation is, to be out there, speaking about and answering questions and bringing clarity to those that might not be as close to the inputs to that strategy. And so you have to make that connection. And that's what I used to call it, being the glue of the organization, connecting the organization like glue. And then I learned this great new word, integrative. It's not new, but years ago I learned it. And that's really when I used to say the glue, there's several roles that are the glue. They connect the organization. It's more like a neural network of connecting tissue in the organization. And that's essential. And it's essential for the leaders to adapt that. So I used to say that you no longer sit at the top of the organization. You do, but that's not how you operate. You actually sit in the middle of the organization. You're actually connecting the pieces that need to know what and when, and getting the resources freed up to be more successful. I mean, how many times have we heard resource constraints as the top three reason for project failure? I think it's in every survey that I've ever seen. The resources disappeared and nobody knows why. They were taken away, sometimes never communicated, yet they continue to work on big pieces of investment. So I think it's not only, it is essential. And I actually would take it a step further. I said, I think it's an absolute accountability of the leader in the organization to do that. And I'll add that it is exhausting. It's not easy. And that's likely why people, kind of let it slip away. It can be exhausting to do that on a perpetual basis, but it's needed, it's necessary, and it will bring success, more success than failure, for sure.
Yeah, it's very hard because in many cases you are trying to change the culture of the organization, especially if it's functional to operate in this neural way. Okay, you have to change mindsets. It's not easy, but if successful, be wonderful. Now I have another interesting question, and they're talking about, do you recommend that the current corporate strategies, they mean government strategies like Vision 2030 KSA or Abu Dhabi 2030 or 2035 Kuwait and so on, Oman, should be again revised as a whole since they became irrelevant from A to Z, or just to provide a temporary strategic attachment?
Well, I'm not sure about the relevance part of that question, like why they're irrelevant. I mean, is that as a result of COVID-19, or is it some other reason? But I believe that I think strategy should be reviewed more frequent, just as we talked about skills development. I don't, not necessarily with the viewpoint of wholesale revising it, but there should be a review cycle built into your strategic planning systems, so that you make sure that what you thought what was needed and valued, and that as you deliver it, that not only did you deliver it, but it has been valued. I mentioned that example of that online community that did exactly what the research said, and it was not successful initially. I think that's necessary. But Antonio mentioned Rita McGrath, who I know very well and have met with and been in events with, and she has a phrase that I've often relied on, which is strategy is not immediate. So even if you do have a review cycle for that strategy, I'm not suggesting that it needs to change entirely, but it should be there because strategy is not immediate. You're not going to know whether 2030 works until you get much closer to 2030. And I think that's true of organization strategy. If you have a 3 to 5 year strategy that you've put together, chances are it's really a 2 to 3 year strategy because that's how rapidly the private sector is moving. But you should have that built in the cycle. And then when you have a more significant checkpoint, 2 to 3 years out, so 2 to 3 years, and then we're going to do a deep dive and see whether all the pieces in this, because strategy is really about assumptions and choices. So there's many assumptions that are built into your strategy, and you need to see whether they come to fruition or not. The customer will value this. Well, the assumption is they will based on solid research, but do they along the way? And you might see that they no longer because something's changed on their end as well. So I think there's kind of more routine, kind of light touch review, and then a deeper dive every 2 to 3 years, depending how long your strategy is. Many organizations are really breaking it down to 1 to 2 years. And I would argue that's probably not really the strategy. It's probably more the implementation plan is 1 to 2 years. Because strategy is much higher level. What's the type of organization do we want? Who's our primary customer? Those type of decisions shouldn't change every year, or you'll never know whether you were successful. These are our primary customers. This is who we're going after. If you change that after a year, you'll never know. You'll never know.
What I think, or I might be sensing, perhaps several of the countries are focusing more on being the resilience aspect. Okay, how to have the internal capabilities and power to sustain and be self-reliant against not only this pandemic. This pandemic came and it shook lots of things, it shaken the grounds under many things to see where we are weak and maybe attempt to these areas. And in turn, perhaps their next cycle of reprioritization came sooner. Many started to think of agriculture or the agribusiness aspect to provide the needed food, water, power, utilities, and of course health. Okay, before that, health has been always a very important aspect of any government plan. But nowadays, perhaps it is the most important because it's about staying alive and securing the health of the whole country. So perhaps maybe projects that were aligned to come or initiatives in 2025 or 27 are going to be implemented today, and other ones more into leisure and would be maybe prioritized till later on until we actually have this resilience innate in us.
Well, and I certainly understand that, and I think that first I'd say that's appropriate, right? So so the prioritization of everything within that strategy is based on a set of assumptions and circumstances at the time it was created. That part of that routine review is when those assumptions and circumstances change, like today, you reprioritize that, and other things are changing on the external. I mean, leisure and travel is pretty well shut down still for the most part, globally. So anything aimed at that would likely receive a lower priority. Anything that has to do with large gathering and events, there's many organizations that, big percentage of their revenue is face-to-face events, and it went in a single day's notice. They no longer had access to the capital that was built up from that. So I think that's part of that review cycle, and having the ability to sense and understand and have already planned scenarios for what you would do if certain of these things and the assumptions and circumstances changed. And I think that's not only appropriate, but it's urgent. I mean, you have to make that change now. But it goes back to some of the strategic choices you made. What is the purpose? What is the mission? What's the most important thing that we do as an organization, or in this case, a government? And inevitably, I would suggest it's almost always going to come back, probably always, to the people, to the citizens that we were accountable for. I've seen it. I spent considerable time in the region, especially towards the end in the UAE, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai. And every conversation I had was about those we serve. And that was true with any time I got together with other leaders in the region. So I think it focuses you to who, it's not a customer, but who's the core group that we serve? Well, it's those that live and that we care for as part of our responsibilities. So I think the good part about that is there's clarity around that. So you don't have to, there's not a lot of questions that have to be determined to say, this is our priority. And then you can prioritize the initiatives around that. Yes, it would be nice to hold the next World Cup, but if no one can attend, and we can't feed our people and there's no clean water, et cetera, then it becomes less important by a large margin.
Maybe all the players would participate in the game behind a PlayStation played by all.
I still can't believe people pay to watch other people do that, but apparently they do. So.
Yeah. Mark, thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure. I like
nice to see you again. We've met each other before for sure many times, but I see your certificates behind you. Did I sign any of those certificates? I might have.
Yeah, several of them. Actually, we were there in California in 2016 when I received my Snyder Award.
That's right. Yeah.
Antonio gave me that award, but you were there, and
it was in San Diego. Yeah, I remember. Yeah, very good. It was my pleasure. If I could help you in the future as well, don't hesitate. And thanks to all the attendees. There's still almost 200 left. Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and good luck in all you do. And be safe and be well.
Thank you very much. Same to you. Okay, thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone, for participating with us tonight. I'd like to apologize again for not being able to take many of the questions. I promise I'll have a look at them, and I will try to collect some answers and maybe get back to you. Let me make dua for everyone for a good Ramadan Kareem, happy Eid, Fitr, stay safe, and see you, inshallah, next Wednesday with Dr. Radia Ben Alia. She's going to speak about emotional intelligence. Until then, stay safe and bye-bye. Thank you. Hello, my name is Dr. Saadi Adra. I'm offering a webinar, Breaking Organizational Silos During the Times of Social Distancing. Join me soon.
This is Dr. Ibrahim Shira speaking to you from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We'll be focusing on public-private partnership contracts and privatization contracts. See you.
Hi, my name is Antonio Neito-Rodriguez. I was the chairman of the Project Management Institute in 2016. Today I'm going to talk to you about why project management needs to reinvent itself, and project managers too. So I look forward to see you in my webinar.
Hi, this is Al Zaytoun from Washington, D.C., USA. I look forward to interacting with you on the Advisors webinar titled Balancing People, Process, and Governance for Operational Sustainability. See you then. So long.
Hi there, I'm Radia Ben Alia from Algeria. I'll be talking to you about emotional intelligence, leadership, and transformational change. I hope you're well. Stay safe.
This is Mustafa Fuzoğlu from Turkey. I'm offering you a webinar with advisors on digital project management.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sean Reagan from California and Prague, and I will be presenting a webinar with advisors on opportunities in crisis and complex situations, so please join me.